Hello, I'm Rick Beeman with Death Discourse. Today we're having a conversation with Dr. Nate Hinerman, who is a licensed psychotherapist in San Francisco. He is also the chairman of the psychology department at Golden State University and a member of the faculty at University of San Francisco and San Francisco State University. Nate has been the chair of the San Francisco End of Life Network and also has done an international conference on death, dying, and grief, both over the last 21 years. It's my pleasure today to be in conversation with Dr. Nate Hinerman. Well, hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for doing this. It'll be kind of a wide-ranging conversation, I expect, a bit, but you know where we want to sort of go, dealing with the issues of generally suffering and acceptance is what I've been working through. And to give you an idea as to in dealing with aging, one of the things I've discovered is part of the tools that one can use in aging are looking at Erikson's stages of life, stages of development, because you watch how those stages develop, and I grant you this is more in chaos than in order. But as things like isolation and identity and those kinds of things develop in his model, as one ages, oftentimes they seem to reverse. So you have issues of identity that are growing as you're developing, and those issues of identity can wane as you age because you've retired, you've lost your autonomy, that's another issue. You have had loss of family and friends, so the isolation naturally increases. And how does that affect your mental attitude as you age? Your identity decreases in the same way. You may no longer be a parent in the worst of situations. So that's one. The second is I see a lot in 12-step processes that there is a parallel between addiction and aging. And how you handle it, in that, you know, addiction you never fully recover from. You are in the process of recovering. Aging is that kind of thing for which there is no recovery either. And there's actually, the only way you can do anything is to find some sense of moral inventory, to find a way to come to acceptance in the Reinhold Niebuhr form of serenity. So I sent you beginnings of a blog and talked about my father, and we can use him as a paradigm. And he's not alone in this by any stretch. He hates aging. He cannot deal with aging. He doesn't know what to do with himself in aging. He's not willing to adapt. He's not willing to do anything that would say, okay, I'm getting older. How do I change who I am, what I'm doing, how I process life?
Yeah, it's good. You know, I hear you. I've got lots of takes. I mean, those are three conversations that overlap, and at the same time, I'm curious to hear, you know, as you stand at the intersection of those three conversations, what's coming up for you, and what's where you're getting some hope, some resilience yourself, maybe where there's questions that you've got or places that you're still wrestling. I get that chaos is one of the themes in each one of the three.
Well, you've dealt with addiction, right? And you've dealt with suicide. You've dealt with issues of aging and particularly approaching death.
Yeah, I'm a psychotherapist here in San Francisco, who has a specialization in working with folks who were dying or folks that are grieving a loss. I see other folks too, but that's my primary focus.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, you know, in my own, years of therapeutic experience, I've come to feel that if I can, as a therapist, enter the world of the person who I'm talking with, that usually some kind of therapeutic movement will occur. If I can achieve a kind of climate, a kind of relationship, a sense of trust, and there are sometimes some conditions in order to achieve that. It's important, for example, for me to be really present as one of the conditions I've found. And not just to be present, but to be aware. But if that can be achieved, then we move into this place of care. And at that point, then, my first goal is to really understand the inner world of this person, from the inside. Can I see the world through their eyes? Will I be sufficiently sensitive, for example, to move around on the inside and to really feel like, or to get some sense of what it feels like to be them? And if I can accurately enter into this person's world of experience, then change and therapeutic movement are at least more likely. Oftentimes in these contexts, the person with whom you're working may start to experience feelings and attitudes more deeply as well. Feeling, prized by me, for example, it might be possible that this person comes to prize him or herself more in that moment. If they can perceive a sense of realness, of genuineness in me, perhaps they'll be able to be a little bit more real or genuine with him or herself in that moment. But if it's possible for me to get really present, this kind of caring attitude, it's possible perhaps that this client too is more aware of their feelings in the immediate moment. And in this way, rather than judgment coming in, we might be able to have more reflection, where the locus of evaluation isn't necessarily outside of the client, but rather starts from within. And in that way, we already begin to create a greater capacity for looking at looking for insight. And anyhow, so those are some of the changes that happen in therapeutic work that can happen very, very quickly, just by intentionality, by being present. And what I've found is that, it's in that moment, in those moments that come after, that already we begin to sort of shift in terms of attitude, in terms of habits, in terms of tendencies and thinking and feeling. And that gets us going. So I oftentimes people, when they come in, they have some kind of behavior, for example, either they want to change, or they have something that they want to achieve, but without that kind of trust, that mutual ongoing kind of therapeutic momentum, at least in my work, and then leading to some shift in meaning or some kind of expanse in insight, then the behavior change is harder to make durable. So that's just the entry point there, in my experience.
Mm-hmm. So in that regard, do you find, and I'm trying to put it in terms that do you find success in helping a person come to a better insight and realization of those things that are of major issues for them that they haven't addressed? For example, in my father's case, just to use him as an example, hating aging and not knowing how to deal with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So aging, of course, is a kind of phenomenological given for those of us that continue to live. And so unlike, let's say, addiction, it's not necessarily a pathology or a disease, but rather a fundamental feature of what it means to be mortal. And so I hear what you're saying in that who am I question is really crucial, and it can really get untethered and pushed into a kind of liminal place, or a place of tremendous difficulty. The way in which we cope too with our mortality has a lot to do with the roles that we take up in society, in families, in work worlds, and so forth. And so to lose those roles or have those augmented in ways perhaps that are beyond our agency, can be very unsettling. And so I'm hearing you say that on one level, it may be that the transition in who he perceives himself to be in culture, in family, in relationships has changed in a way that he's grieving, perhaps.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so, my first take there, we could set about, if we were going to get philosophical and try and define some common theological or philosophical explanations of the problem of, I'm going to introduce a new word here, of suffering. Mm-hmm. And with that definition, we might, come to a mutual understanding of some of the limitations of being an embodied creature, and some of the dangers, for example, that we, have to sort of traverse in order to find not just insight or behavior change, but to find meaning and significance. But my first goal, would be to identify with him to the extent that I could, and to really find out more about what the nature, of this hate is, or the suffering, if that's happening.
And suffering is a better term.
Okay, so suffering, of course, is almost better explained in a metaphorical fashion. As you know, as we talked before, the experience of suffering, generally speaking, includes feelings of powerlessness, perhaps meaninglessness, affliction, alienation, which could be physical, psychological, social, all of those things, and so forth. And so, physical pain might be part of that too. Mm-hmm. I think that that how do we respond to suffering is a question that's endured since the first person drew breath. But in my experience, that experience of suffering where there isn't a felt sense of being able to express it, that sense of muteness, if you'd like, is a really tough place. And when I'm assessing someone in a session, or if I'm just out there in the world, or looking at myself, those places where I have a hard time making contact with language, for example, are the places that I really tune into. Some of the suffering and some of the affect that we have may be ineffable in the moment or in a particular time. But finding some kind of language, whether it's a cry, a lamentation, something nonverbal, usually is one of the most preliminary and crucial steps, I think, to beginning to organize some sense of liberation, or some kind of treatment or intervention or way of understanding, or even consoling the suffering. So that stage of trying to find the language for what's really going on is really, really crucial.
In that sense, there is a co-identity. As you're talking about trying to find out where the person is coming from, joining in lamentation.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense what you're saying, that there is a way in which to disengage from asserting outcomes, and instead to sort of be able to check in and really hear what perhaps is being communicated on a deeper level. And the extent to which, whether that involves lamentation, frustration, is a fundamental conduit to getting a little bit deeper into what it is that's troubling or bubbling from underneath. I mean, that we have to understand another person, kind of where they're coming from, irrespective of what kinds of outcomes or things that we think that they may need or be demanding here in this particular moment. You know, so it really, in a certain sense, is a good example of truly an example of active listening, really.
And it's that element that I find important in aging. As I talk to people, for example, that say, I don't know why I'm still alive. I've lost all of my connections. I've lost my family. I'm still here at 100 years old. Why? And I struggle, frankly, to get to a place of identity with that I feel like I need to find. All I can do is hold her or acknowledge her pain.
Yes.
But there are no platitudes. There are no opportunities to say, well, it'll be all right. No, it won't. So what can you do? In this case, with this particular woman, I just simply said, would you like to pray?
Mm-hmm.
And the prayer was simply for comfort and direction.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel like the prayer got answered?
You know, prayers are funny things in that they don't necessarily have the outcome you think they're going to have. In her case, she couldn't figure out why she was still alive. She was days shy of her 100th birthday, did not want to see 100, and she died. And in that case, that was probably the best outcome that there could have been.
So how to engage with someone who is feeling like, you know, there's no point, or there's a tremendous amount of suffering yet to bear, and the question of identity keeps echoing as a refrain. What am I to do? Who am I to be today? What impact will it have? Will it matter to other people? Does it matter to me? I'm hearing you say that, you know, what can we do to sojourn with people who are in that situation? Exactly. Where there's not asymmetry as such, because in a certain sense, like you pointed out, we don't necessarily have the answers to those questions. And yet, I think we probably would agree that you and I know, though, what it's like to be frustrated, forlorn, to not know our way, to feel lost, to have that existential angst. So kind of going back to how we started, I mean, that's the entry point, because there's probably a tremendous, you know, warehouse of stories and meaning making and language that this person has that would perhaps be very therapeutic to share. And so before I can skillfully, sensitively, lovingly, whatever word you want to use, move along with this person, I really need to get grounded in where you know, as Raymond Carver likes to say, where they're calling from. So the directionality of where this goes, it's not always clear. I love the prayer that you made, and I too, you know, resonate with this sense that prayer is, in a certain sense, a way of paying attention. And so the way in which I can model the paying attention is another way of shared togetherness that I think we could identify as prayerful. Well, I start from the premise that we're meaning hungry people in general. So we consuming meaning, whether to be distracted by it, our phones or some kind of media, or consuming, you know, some kind of leisurely activity, or, you know, we could talk about significance as well. Those kinds of moments that are outside the mundane, you're summiting El Capitan or whatever it is. Here we're having this nice conversation, which is a nice way to spend some time today. This is out of the ordinary. It's special. You know, this is you and I are kind of opening our hearts to one another. And although we're friends and have been colleagues, we haven't quite done this before. So to see the extraordinary amongst the ordinary. So these are all meaning-making exercises. And so this engagement sort of tends to give rise to what's most important for the person and for oneself sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in part where it goes, the shared meaning making process. We're doing it right now. The telos, of where this goes to our earlier, acknowledgement may not be clearly defined.
Mm-hmm.
Is it peace? Is it reassurance? Is that what would be nice to have in this moment? I mean, is it acceptance? Is it resilience? Is it a kind of energy that, what is it that we're going for?
Mm-hmm. And that's not a specific, that's not a catch-all that you can give to everybody. It's each person's going to have their own level of whatever it is: acceptance, forgiveness, peace, joy, gratitude, awe.
That's right. I mean, one of the things about true engagement is that we begin to share in the exercise of communicating deeply, truly with one another, a way of being that perhaps can be patterned outside of this particular moment. So what we're doing and paying attention to one another, shoring each other up, supporting one another, and so forth, accrues a kind of momentum. I mean, ideally. And so, that in and of itself is the kind of substance, it's the primordial soup for these longer term kinds of project taking. I agree. We talked about this in another conversation, but I think we were talking about gratitude practices.
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that we start the day with that could be used not just as consolation, but as sort of guideposts? Who do I want to be today? Where is it that I'm trying to go? And so these affirmations, depending on what one sets for the intention, you and I were talking about how the profound kind of therapeutic effect those can have.
People latch on to certain elements of meaning.
Yes,
help define their lives.
I mean, there's been a movement there, right? You have a death discourse that's probably starts off with folks, I would imagine, coming in, wondering about dying anxiety or experiencing that on some level. And here they're talking about come and share with us a sense of awe and wonderment post-election.
Well, first of all, let me be clear. In spite of the name death discourse, and there are people that would say, and we have very deep, albeit short, conversations about death that evolve through the course of this, but through COVID, these weekly meetings have become a check-in more than they have become a death discourse. But then all of a sudden it goes deep, surprisingly, and then comes back out.
Yeah.
So this is just an interesting element of needing the community. That point of what I refer to, thank you, Mandela, as Ubuntu.
Yes. Nice.
That,
yes, that's right.
There is a group identity and they don't want to lose that. We have women, a woman that is experiencing deep grief from a loss of her husband a year ago, but she has, for all sorts of reasons, has had issues around that. And so, for example, she's broken out crying and talking about the level of grief that she's feeling. Look to me for some sort of calm. And the advantage of this community was I could look to the former UCC pastor who also lost her husband under similar circumstances, and a United Methodist pastor's wife who lost her husband under similar circumstances, says, I can't speak to this. I can tell you grief won't go away, and grief is an expression of love. But Jane, what can you say? So it's that kind of ability to understand and who's been through what and how, and know effectively where to meet somebody, and their willingness to be open enough to do that.
That's right. And the irony to perhaps an outsider may be that it's oftentimes the places of brokenness where sort of the floorboards get exposed to find the places of greatest resilience as well. I mean, that is to say, it's in the shared sense of what it means to experience a loss, perhaps, that she's able to sort of drink some of that groundwater and, find some coping potency, some sense of meaning, even in the lamentation. So, like, for example, you could have gone in and said, well, Kubler-Ross has these stages of grief, or you could have gone in and said, I was talking to my buddy Nate, and he was saying, that there's this grief work model that we used to do in the 80s all the time, and here are the steps, and I think it would really help. And here's a pamphlet, and you could have handed that. Well, and there are, I suppose, times for that. But here you gave, that's right. That felt sense of being heard provides a kind of directionality. It changes, it loosens up, it can make space for, however metaphor you want to, in order to allow for other types of meaning making to enter into. So it's very much, like you said, it's facilitating something and, not clinging to sort of outcomes as such, other than that this is important and worth pursuing, this conversation, this person, this moment, this group, on and on, as we've said. But for you, do you find that when you're in these groups that you are thrust back on places in your training, experiences in your life where you felt defeated, confused, lonely, or do you tend to sort of track to lessons that you learned that were more uplifting, or perhaps, like, where is your mind at when you are doing the facilitation?
Well, the good religious answer is both. But it was last week, I think it was last week, we got to talking about having a revisit of a conversation where in September, one of the residents shot himself, committed suicide. And the way the retirement home handled it was okay. I was called in to do some counseling and the like, and then we had one death discourse dedicated to that. Then 6 weeks later, this topic came up again, which is a long roundabout way to answer, but somebody then talked about suicide generally, and we understood the basis for this gentleman's suicide, which was he was getting progressively demented through Parkinson's. And so it wasn't just clinical depression. He'd made it clear to the residents that he was going to do this at some point. Didn't tell them how, which was the more upsetting part. But in checking in with this, and with the case of a woman who also did VSED for voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, I have not met a resident that doesn't go, yeah, I get it. So to answer your question to the point, we revisited this conversation last week, and somebody said they had thoughts of suicide themselves, and they sure understood. And I volunteered that I had a point where I was sitting on the top step at my ex-wife's house at 3 a.m. trying to figure out where to park to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. That, yeah, I feel there are times you have to share that kind of difficult, intimate relationship that indicates, yeah, I'm 30 years younger than many of you, but I've been where you've been. I don't have answers for it, but, and it changes the dynamic.
So that that those stories and your capacity to relate to those, and I get how important and crucial that was to generating a kind of solidarity amongst these thoughts. Yeah, and we also, I think the coda of that suicide conversation, involved how, on the one hand, it makes sense given the experience of suffering and how excruciating that can be, that one would begin to wonder about the moorings for ongoing project taking, meaning making, relationship building, and so forth. And what's the point? But I do get your fundamental point, that we almost all of us run up against, which is, why am I here? Who do I want to be today? Is it enough? What's going to get me out of bed? And that kind of thing. Those are fundamental questions I've had different answers to over the years, but I've always, maybe it was the way in which you and I were raised, because we were talking about this too. I mean, I can remember thinking that at 12 years old, what's going on here? 13 years old. I mean, it pretty much has manifested itself through 50 years almost of being a human, So the nature of the question itself makes a lot of sense. It really is the threshing floor. Why? Why today? Why now? Why me? I mean, that's really so I mean, if we can, the extent to which we get back to that place, I think is really that fundamental kind of starting point can be an extraordinarily helpful prism through which to then begin to sort of process the day's events, maintaining the capacity to be present. This goes back to the affirmation thing. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this thing called life, this thing today? Who am I serving? Sometimes it's about that, that focus, and so on. I really resonate with what you're saying, though. It's I'm happy to go more into this too if you want. This is
well, let's see if you can help. We've talked a little bit about this, but trying to get tools to sweep up that threshing floor and find meaning.
Yeah, find the nutrition amongst the chaff.
Exactly. I love the analogy, the visual image. But what are your thoughts around that? Because, a lot of that, to me, a lot of that is, how does one move through the suffering? You have to constantly acknowledge the pain, but you don't constantly have to be suffering.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what my whole issue of acceptance is that at that point you're saying, okay, the biggest challenge I see frequently is that people who are suffering the most are those that are unwilling to accept those things they cannot change.
Yes. There you go.
So if you can get to where somebody is, how can you give them sort of the tools or the wherewithal or support necessary to recognize acceptance without defeatism or fatalism?
Yeah. Well, if someone's running for the Golden Gate and they're committed to jumping,
they're going to jump.
Probably. So we can, appeal to all sorts of aspects of the psychological apparatus and tell them reasons why, tell them, no, don't do it. Why? Because it matters to me. But if someone wants to persevere, they can.
Sure.
So there is that, of course. I think going back to what you said, in the group, when you shared that experience of sitting on the top step, with your ex-wife and having this thought about the Golden Gate Bridge and where to park and the details that you share here. I mean, it's powerful, you know, and it really is, you know, capital T truth there, you know, being, that's a phrase I stole from my days in Methodism, which I know you had those days too, but, you know, I could imagine how the experience of others in the group that resonated with yours just must have just been so heard in that moment, that powerful kind of solidarity and sort of cohesion. Wow. So this person with all these degrees, you know, and these websites and all of the, you know, incredible nomenclature, and he's a philosopher and a theologian, you know, Rick Beeman, and here he's been in this place too. So I mean, I can imagine how significant that was. So, you know, they probably could have asked you in the same moment, well, why didn't you? And how did you pick up the wheat and separate the chaff? How did you vacuum up the places that you wanted to, and the pieces that you wanted to keep, and that sort of thing? What would you have said?
Well, I did say, my daughter.
Yeah.
I wouldn't, you were talking about the generational ramifications. I would
That's
not
right.
want to do that to my daughter.
Yeah. Well,
But
brother,
I told my daughter about that experience, and
yes.
she was my raison d'etre.
Yeah.
She saved my life in that regard.
Yes, sir. Sometimes there are places where the intervention of someone else saying, hey, Daddy, don't do that. I don't want you to do that. Even if it's not said, please don't do that. That's what we need to hear, to remind ourselves of how mutually included and embedded we are. It's not, that decision isn't just mine to make. It has a cascading effect on everybody that's around me. And in that way, when we talk about conversion, you know, we typically think of conversion to a kind of religious community, but I think of it much broader, in that conversion really speaks to a kind of deepening in accountability and responsibility. And I can do that intellectually, I can do that emotionally, when I regulate my affect appropriately and don't lean on a horn, you know, to someone who made a mistake. You know, who do I want to be? And to see that responsibility and accountability in my interpersonal relationships, in my socio-political expressions, and in those religious decisions that I make, you know, what do I see as the foundation of a particular religious community that's being promoted as something that I ought to follow? Do I have congruence with that? So yes, I think there are times where we say we can be engaged by another to say, no, you know, no, now it's time, or don't do that. Yeah, and left to our own devices, you know, I think that's where I was trying to go earlier with this notion of suffering, that oftentimes suffering that doesn't have a voice and doesn't have a hearer to receive the testimony is the kind of suffering that leads to a kind of world destroying nature. To be mute and cut off amidst the suffering, and then also to not have someone to engage and to be able to receive it, to hear it. I mean, it's, in a certain sense, it sounds oversimplifying, because I mean, if we went into this other room, I could show you, you know, like you have 3,000 books that have been written on this subject, and that's no lie. But really, it comes down to that, you know, and thank God it does, because that means that my daughter at whatever age can do that for me. She doesn't have to have a PhD to get it. That she can engage me in that place and say, don't do that, you know, and to have that be, you know, the truest, most important thing that I could have possibly imagined to hear. So, yeah.
No, I think going back to the original points I was making about the Ericksonian issues of identity and changing identity, which what you're responding to, the way I hear it, is, or stating in this context, is that suffering is in many respects here the result of isolation. It's also the loss of identity, but they go hand in glove. That without some sense of affirmation, community relation, appreciation and awe of what you have or what is available to you, even if it's in the context of Half Dome or something like that, that you know, first of all, and I'm just going to try and summarize here. First of all, getting to where the other person is the first and most important thing, to understand who they are and let them explain it to you.
Yes.
And then work toward some means of re-engaging.
Yes.
In whatever manifestation that may be for that particular person under their particular circumstances. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, very good. Can I add one thing?
Sure, please.
So I love what you said. I think it's right on. It's important. And I just wanted to go back and to this notion of identity. I think the forgive the language here, but the clinging to an identity is a tough putt, because identities aren't stable, they're fluid.
Right.
We have many different identities, really. So if we want to talk about something about ourselves that's unchanging, well, probably going to have to retreat into some kind of, social or philosophical or theological kind of territory to name that. So, but we can talk about, I think, the relationship, like you were talking about, between 12-step and something around aging, which is that, so often changes in identity require a kind of open-mindedness, a willingness to try new things, and a willingness to take direction, to trust someone else who's been down this road, who may know some things that would sure be handy for me to know. And I think a lot of life is like that. And I think aging, and as I'm 50, I mean, I feel that more and more every day. I know, I hear you. But just that. So this goes back into the Buddhist parable, of the expert mind and the beginner's mind. I mean, the more that I can stay open-minded, not cling to a kind of stable identity that doesn't really exist or persist in any way, take direction from others who may know a little bit more on the journey, and be willing to change. And change requires growth oftentimes, and growth is painful so oftentimes, and so we want to jettison that. But that's part of the deal.
Well, I will let you go now.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Much love to you. Thank you for all the work that you're doing, Rick.